Hello and welcome to Alden Carrow's Poetry Podcast. I'm Alden Carrow, poet, walker and author of Cornwall in Verse, Tides Touring Poetry. This is a podcast for people who suspect, as I do, that the world is moving too quickly and that something quietly extraordinary waits for anyone willing to slow down, listen closely and pay proper attention to it. In every episode, I share two poems. The first is a guest poem from the wider world of verse, something that has stayed with me, or troubled me, or refused to let me go. The second is one of my own, drawn from the moors, the coasts, the weather, and the strange beauty of ordinary days. And for your chance to win a signed copy of Cornwall in Verse, Tides Touring Poetry, I invite you to suggest a future guest poem by emailing me at aldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's aldencarrow78@gmail.com. The next guest poem will come from one of you. Today we are exploring an idea that has followed me on every windward path I have walked this year and every quiet morning at the writing desk. Solitude is not a punishment, it is an instrument. We tend to speak of being alone as something to be endured, or worse, as something to be cured, a problem the world keeps offering to solve for us. But there is another way of holding it. There are people and there are places that have understood solitude not as deprivation, but as a practice, a technique, a way of making oneself fit to hear what the noisier world drowns out. We are going to sit with that idea this week, beginning at a wild Irish water edge with William Butler Yeats, where the voices of the fairy world call a human child away from a world too full of weeping, and then crossing in the second half to a small island off the Cornish coast where the wind writes verses on the sand and the only thing required of you to read them is to be willing to stand still long enough. So pour something warm, settle in, the wind is up, the light is going, and there is poetry to be found. To begin our journey, we travel west across the Irish Sea to the wild water edges of County Sligo and into the imagination of a very young William Butler Yeats. He was only 21 when he wrote The Stolen Child, and it was one of the first poems to bring him real attention. It appeared in 1886 in a small Dublin magazine and was collected 3 years later in his first major book, The Wanderings of Alden and Other Poems. It is, in some ways, a poem that announces the whole career to come, the wild Irish landscape, the half-believed fairy world, the strange and slightly dangerous music that runs underneath everything Yeats would later write. The poem belongs to a tradition older than Yeats himself. In Irish folklore, the stolen child is a real and frightening figure, the changeling, the human infant said to be carried off by the fairy host and replaced with one of their own. Whole communities lived with the genuine fear of it. Yeats grew up on stories of children lured into the hills by music, into the lakes by lights on the water, into the woods by voices that promised something more beautiful than the human world could offer. He took that folk tradition and did something extraordinary with it. He turned the changeling story inside out. He let the fairy voices speak the poem. He gave them the persuasion, and he made it impossible by the end to be entirely sure whether the calling away is a horror or a mercy. I have chosen it because it is, I think, the wildest and most musical statement in English of the question this episode is asking. We have been speaking lately about the value of small quiet places, about Bedale and its contented hush, about Bodmin and its haunted stone. Yeats writes from the other side of that argument. His poem is set at a wild water edge that has not been domesticated at all, and the voices that rise out of it are not asking the human child to listen more closely to the human world. They are asking him to leave it. And the reason they give, in the refrain that repeats 4 times across the poem, is a line that has haunted readers for nearly a century and a half. The world's more full of weeping than you can understand. That line is the philosophical hinge of the piece. Yeats is not writing a children's poem, despite the surface charm of berries and fairy vats and dancing on the sand. He is writing about why a soul might choose to step out of the human world altogether, about the temptation and perhaps the wisdom of solitude when the world becomes too noisy with its grief. Come away, the fairies say, and what they are offering is not company exactly. It is a different kind of aloneness, the aloneness of someone who has gone where the weeping cannot follow. Held next to tonight's host poem, which we will come to in the second half, the 2 pieces describe the same wild edge from opposite directions. Yeats writes the magnetism of the wild place pulling someone toward it. My own poem stands on the wild place itself, choosing to remain there. Between them, I hope, we will find the shape of an argument the episode is trying to make, that solitude is not a punishment, and not even finally an absence, it is an instrument. Let's listen to the words first. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake the drowsy water rats. There we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wave of moonlight glosses the dim grey light sands with light, far off by furthest roses we foot it all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances, till the moon has closed her eyes. We leap and chase the frolics, we foot it all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances, till the moon has closed her eyes. We leap and chase the frolics, we'll fill the night with fairy glee, and the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wandering water gushes from the hills above Glencar, in pools among the rushes that scarce could bathe a star, we seek for slumbering trout, and whispering in their ears, give them unquiet dreams, leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears over the young streams. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Away with us he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob around and round the oatmeal chest. For he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. There is a haunting quality to this poem that fits our discussion of solitude perfectly. Yeats uses the fairy, not just as a mythological creature, but as a personification of the wild, unpeopled spaces. When the fairies call the child to the waters and the wild, they are calling him into a state of existence that is removed from the weeping of human society. It is a removal from the noise of the kettle on the hob and the domestic peace of the oatmeal chest. While the poem is often read as a cautionary tale or a sad abduction, I've always seen it as an invitation to the necessary isolation that the soul requires to see clearly. The imagery of Sleuthwood and Glencar, real places in County Sligo, grounds this ethereal invitation into the physical earth. It suggests that solitude isn't some distant imaginary realm. It is as close as the nearest rocky highland or wandering water gush. When we step into these spaces, we are stolen from our routine, and in that theft we find a different kind of vision. The child is described as solemn-eyed. This isn't the eye of a victim, but the eye of one who has seen something profound in the silence of the ferns. To be a poet or any kind of creator, one must occasionally allow oneself to be stolen by the landscape. We must leave the warmth of the hillside carves and the domestic comforts to find the leafy island where the herons wake the water rats. In that space, between the wave of moonlight and the dim grey sands, we find the rhythm of a different world. Yeats reminds us that the world is heavy with weeping, a weight that can often drown out the smaller, more delicate sounds of our own thoughts. By stepping into the wild, we aren't just escaping, we are retreating to a place where we can process that weeping and turn it into something enduring. This poem sets the stage for our theme, that being alone or being taken away from the crowd is not a loss of life, but a gaining of a deeper, more resonant perspective. Moving from the Irish coast to the Isles of Scilly, I'd like to share a piece of mine called Bry here. If you've never been to the Scilly Isles, they sit off the coast of Cornwall, a tiny archipelago where the Atlantic hits first and hits hardest. Bry here is the smallest of the uninhabited islands, and it has a particular energy, a rugged, unyielding sense of self. It is a place where solitude is not just a concept, but a geographical reality. Here is the poem, Bry here. The waves strike hard on Hell Bay's shore, where granite stands and seabirds soar. The wind writes verses on the sand that only Bry here understands. Potato fields and sea-worn stone, a cottage sits, proud and alone. Its windows watch the western swell and hold the storm as stories tell. The tide divides, then draws in tight, each inlet bathed in shifting light, a place where silence finds its voice and solitude becomes a choice. Bry here breathes in salt and flame, a rugged isle with quiet name. She holds her ground, both fierce and fair, a whisper in the ocean air. I wrote this poem after a period of intense work, when I felt the need to find a place where the world couldn't reach me. Bry here was that place. The poem begins with Hell Bay, which is exactly as the name suggests, a place of violent, crashing water and jagged granite. But notice how even in that violence there is a creative act. The wind writes verses on the sand. The island doesn't need an audience, it understands its own poetry. This reflects the inner life of the artist. We often feel we need to be understood by everyone, but true solitude teaches us that it is enough sometimes to understand ourselves. The image of the cottage, proud and alone, is central here. In our modern world, we are taught to fear being alone. We see it as a lack of social success. But that cottage isn't lonely, it is proud. It has its windows turned toward the western swell, watching the storm not with fear, but as a witness. This is what I mean when I say solitude is an instrument. It allows us to be the witness to our own storms. The stanza, a place where silence finds its voice and solitude becomes a choice, is the heart of the matter. Silence is often thought of an absence, the absence of sound, but on an island like Bry here, or in the middle of a writing retreat, silence becomes a presence. It becomes a voice that tells you things you wouldn't hear over the din of your daily life. When solitude is forced upon us, it can feel like a punishment. But when it becomes a choice, It transforms into a tool. It becomes the medium through which we carve out our best work. On Bryher, the salt and flame represent the elemental nature of being alone. It strips away the unnecessary layers of the persona we project to the world, leaving only the rugged isle of the self. This is the whisper in the ocean air, the quiet, resilient core that remains when the noise of the world is filtered out by the tide. And now it's time for our discussion this week. Writing retreats, solitude as a craft technique. Let's delve into this idea. Solitude is not a punishment, it is an instrument. In the context of writing, this is most clearly practiced through the concept of the writing retreat. Now, when I talk about a writing retreat, I'm not necessarily talking about a fancy hotel in the south of France, though that does sound lovely. I'm talking about the intentional removal of oneself from the social and domestic sphere for the express purpose of artistic excavation. For many writers, the word solitude can be frightening. We are social animals. We thrive on connection. Yet, the paradox of the writer is that while we write about human connection, we can only do so effectively when we have distanced ourselves from it enough to see it clearly. Think of a painter. To see the mountain, they cannot be standing inside the mountain. They must stand some miles away. Solitude provides that distance. In my own practice, especially when working on North Yorkshire verse mortarshore in poetry, I found that the poems written in the heat of a busy day were often cluttered. They were full of the static of my morning emails, the concerns of my neighbours, the hum of the television. It wasn't until I took myself off to the edges of the North York moors, to places like Rosedale or the high cliffs of Bulby, that the clutter began to fall away. This is the first technique of solitude, the decompression. When you first enter a state of solitude on a retreat, the silence is deafening. You hear your own thoughts, and frankly, those first thoughts are usually quite boring. They are lists of chores and anxieties. Most people get uncomfortable here and reach for their phones, but the craft technique is to stay, to sit in that boredom. Solitude is the instrument that drills through that top layer of noise to get to the signal. In a writing retreat, you are essentially training your brain to stop looking for external stimulation and start looking for internal resonance. You begin to notice the way the light changes on the wall, the specific rhythm of your own breathing, the way a single word carries a weight you hadn't noticed before. This leads us to the second technique, sensory attunement. When we are with others, our senses are focused on social cues. We are listening for tone of voice, watching body language, preparing our next response. In solitude, those senses are freed. Suddenly you can hear the wind writing verses on the sand, as I mentioned in Bryher. You can notice the ferns that drop their tears in Yeats's Sligo. This isn't just about poetic fluff. It is a high-level observation that is only possible when the social brain is turned off. A writing retreat is a laboratory for this kind of observation. Another vital aspect of solitude as an instrument is the elasticity of time. In our daily lives, time is a grid. We have appointments, deadlines, and schedules. On a retreat, time becomes fluid. You can spend 4 hours looking at a single stanza. You can wake up at 3 a.m. and write for 6 hours because the kettle on the hob isn't demanding your attention. This temporal freedom allows the subconscious to take the lead. Most of our best writing comes from the subconscious, but the subconscious is shy. It won't come out if there is a crowd. Solitude is the invitation it needs to emerge. But I do want to be clear, this instrument must be handled with care. Solitude can slip into isolation if one is not careful. The goal of a retreat is not to become a hermit forever, but to gather the salt and flame of the experience and bring it back to the warm hillside of the world. It's a rhythmic process, retreat and return, breathe in and breathe out. Even if you can't afford a week-long retreat, you can practice micro-solitude, an hour in a park without a phone, a solo walk on the moors, or even just closing the door to a room and declaring it the wild for a set period. Use the solitude. Don't just endure it. Let it strip away the weeping world until you find the solemn-eyed part of yourself that knows what it truly wants to say. Solitude is the whetstone that sharpens the blade of your craft. Without it, your work will always be slightly dull, slightly muffled by the voices of others. When you choose solitude, you are choosing to listen to the only voice that can write your poems, and that voice is your own. And so now we come to the end of another walk together. We have stood at the water's edge with William Butler Yeats, listening to the fairy voices call a human child away from a world too full of weeping, and we have crossed to the small Cornish island of Bryhere, where the wind writes verses on the sand and a single cottage holds its ground against the western swell. Two wild edges, 2 centuries apart, and the same quiet argument running between them, that solitude isn't a punishment, and not even, finally, an absence. It is an instrument. It is something we can learn to play and use. So now I would love to hear from you. If there is a poem you would like featured in a future episode, a classic, something modern, or a personal favourite you've carried with you for years, please email me at aldencarrow78@gmail.com. That is aldencarrow78@gmail.com. Every suggestion is entered into the draw for a signed copy of Cornwall in Verse, Tied to Touring Poetry, sent to you by hand. The next guest poem will come from one of you, and that is precisely how I want this podcast to work. Not as a broadcast made across a busy room, but as the kind of slow exchange that only happens when both people have learned to be properly still. That email again, aldencarrow78@gmail.com, is in the episode description. So thank you for listening, for slowing down with me, and for being willing to treat your own solitude as something worth keeping. Until next time, may you find poetry waiting for you in the everyday, and I look forward to speaking to you again on Wednesday.